Welcome to our Sunday School Bible study time here at Southwest Park Baptist Church. This is our lesson for Sunday, June 26th. We're continuing to study in 1 Kings. The first three lessons that we've had in 1 Kings have dealt with Solomon's reign, and so this week we move on from after the death of Solomon. Our lesson's entitled Divided, Failure to Listen to Wise Counsel Contributes to Conflict. Our larger scripture lesson this week is 1 Kings 12 through chapter 14. We'll focus on chapter 12, the first 19 verses there. At the end of chapter 11, in last week's lesson, it tells us that the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. Then Solomon lay down with his fathers and was buried in the city of his father David, and his son Rehoboam reigned in his place. So as we pick up in chapter 12, the first 5 verses here kind of set the scene for our focal passage today. Verse 1 in chapter 12 tells us that then Rehoboam went to Shechem because all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. Shechem is about 30 miles north of Jerusalem, I believe, and it was an important site in the history of Israel. That's where Joseph's bones that they brought from Egypt were buried. And it's also the place where at the end of Joshua's life, after they had come in and possessed the promised land, when Joshua was nearing the end of his life, he called all Israel together at Shechem there, and he challenged the people of Israel to follow God. So it's a historic and significant place in Israel. Verse 2 tells us, now when Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, heard about this, he was living in Egypt, for he was still in Egypt where he had fled from the presence of King Solomon. Then they sent word and summoned him, and Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam, saying, your father made our yoke hard, but now lighten the hard labor imposed by your father, and his heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you. And then Rehoboam said to them, depart for 3 days and return to me. So the people departed. We got introduced to Jeroboam at the end of last week's lesson when Solomon became enamored of the gods of his wives and began to drift away from the Lord. There were some adversaries, and Jeroboam's listed as one of those adversaries. He actually was a part of Solomon's workforce, and the head of the forced labor in the tribe of Joseph there. And because the Lord had told Jeroboam that he was going to divide the kingdom, he was going to tear the most of the kingdom away from Solomon's heirs, and Jeroboam would become king. And so Solomon had tried to have Jeroboam killed, and so he had fled to Egypt. And so this tells us he was still in Egypt, but now, after Solomon's death, he's summoned to come back to Israel, and it appears he's kind of in the forefront of those who are coming to negotiate or to speak with Rehoboam. Their message to Rehoboam is lighten the load on us. You remember we talked about on more than one occasion that when Israel had asked for a king, Samuel had warned them that having a king would be a very costly luxury. If you look back in 1 Samuel chapter 8, you can find that account. And so all of those things that Samuel warned about were done by Solomon. And so it was a very heavy burden on the people. They had been conscripted to work. We read about how when King Hiram was bringing timbers from Lebanon, that there was a 30,000 workforce, 30,000 person workforce that rotated. And they spent 4 months in Lebanon, and then they would come back, 10,000 each time. And then there were others who were conscripted to work. So the burden on the people had been heavy. And so their message to Rehoboam was, Solomon made our yoke hard, but now lighten the load on us and we will serve you. And so Rehoboam said to him, give me 3 days to consider this and come back. So that brings us up to verse 6, and that's where we will start our lesson today. Verses 6 and 7. King Rehoboam consulted with the elders who had served his father Solomon while he was still alive, saying, how do you advise me to answer this people? And then they spoke to him, saying, if you will be a servant to this people today, and will serve them and grant them their request and speak pleasant words to them, then they will be your servants always. So, the first thing that Rehoboam did was he consulted with the elders, and those are, the word elder can have various meanings, but the sense is usually those who are experienced and wise because of their years of experience. And these were those who had served his father. And so, as having served in leadership and advisory positions during Solomon's reign, they were well acquainted with the traditions of Israel. They understood how Solomon's reign had affected the lives of the ordinary Israelites. So on the surface here, as we look at verse 6, it appears that Rehoboam was acting wisely in seeking counsel from these experienced counselors who could give him sound advice. As we're going to see, though, that what appears is not what's actually happening. And his language here in verse 6, how do you advise me to answer this people? This people, that phrase might indicate that Rehoboam already viewed the people that he was king over with a kind of a haughty and a condescending attitude. Well, verse 7 tells us the advice that they gave him. Rehoboam was advised to grant the demands of the northern tribes to gain their loyalty. Notice their language. They advised him to be a servant to the people. If you will be a servant to this people today and serve them. Though entrusted with power, the Israelite king was to establish justice, was to serve both God and his people. We see that spelled out back in Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 20. Psalm 72 is also in that same vein. Warren Wiersbe, in his commentary, points out that the people were willing to serve Rehoboam if only he would serve them and make life a bit easier for them. And as he points out, all of God's truly great leaders had been servants to the people. Moses, Joshua, Samuel, David. And so now Rehoboam has the opportunity and was advised to follow this good example, to be a servant and serve the people. When the Son of God came to earth, he came as a servant, and he taught his disciples to lead by serving. Jesus washed his disciples' feet as an example of human service. John 13, the first 17 verses. He wants us to follow that example, not the example of the great leaders, in quotes, of the secular world. In Matthew chapter 20, starting in verse 25, Jesus says this, "But Jesus called them to himself and said, 'You know that the rulers of the Gentiles domineer over them, and those in high position exercise authority over them. It is not this way among you, but whoever wants to become prominent among you shall be your servant. Whoever desires to be first among you shall be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many.'" So the advice to Rehoboam from these experienced counselors: be a servant, serve the people, lighten their load. Let's read on and see what Rehoboam did with this sound advice. Verses 8 through 15. "But he," Rehoboam, "ignored the advice of the elders which they had given him, and consulted with the young men who had grown up with him and served him. He said to them, 'What advice do you give, so that we may answer this people who have spoken to me, saying, lighten the yoke which your father put on us?' And the young men who had grown up with him spoke to him, saying, 'This is what you should say to this people who spoke to you, saying, your father made our yoke heavy, now you make it lighter for us. You should speak this way to them: my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. Now then, my father loaded you with a heavy yoke, yet I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions.' And then Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam on the third day, just as the king had directed, saying, 'Return to me on the third day.' And the king answered the people harshly, for he ignored the advice of the elders which they had given him. And he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, 'My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions.' So the king did not listen to the people, because it was a turn of events from the Lord, in order to establish his word, which the Lord spoke through Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat." So verse 8 tells us that Rehoboam ignored the advice of the elders, and instead he turned to the young men who had grown up with him, literally who had stood before and served him. In making important decisions, it's important that we seek sound spiritual counsel. And we need to make sure that the counselors we talk to are mature, who are able to give us sound advice. The British writer Frank Boreham said, "We make our decisions, and then our decisions turn around and make us." Sometimes we forget our decisions, but our decision can never forget us, because we reap what we sow. And if the path we choose turns out to be a detour, then we need to admit it, confess our sins, and ask the Lord to lead us back to the right road. The elders gave Rehoboam the best advice: be a servant of the people, and the people will serve you. But it seems that Rehoboam had already made up his mind, so he immediately rejected that answer. He turned to his contemporaries, and there's an implication here that he knew they would give him the answer that he wanted. He had no intention of seeking God's will and making the wise choice. There's no evidence anywhere in this account that the king sought the Lord in prayer or that he consulted with the priest or with a prophet. We get the impression that his mind was made up, and he's going through the motions just to please the people. So he said to these young men, his contemporaries here, what advice do you give so that we may answer this people who have spoken to me? The people who have said, lighten the yoke which your father put on us. It's a reminder again to us what Rehoboam says here in verse 9. It reminds us of the burden that Solomon had put on the people. Now he had experienced peace during the 40 years of his reign, but it came at a cost with all those political alliances, all those marriages with princesses, and all of the forced labor that produced the buildings and all of the things that he accomplished here. So the young man who had grown up with him, and that phrase who had grown up with him can be translated who had become great with him. And that suggests that they had acquired power and influence recently here. And so perhaps that factors into the advice that they're giving him. And they say to him, this is what you should say to this people. And basically they used a kind of a figure of speech there. My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. In essence, they're advising Rehoboam to say to the people, if you thought my father, Solomon, was hard and his yoke was heavy, you haven't seen anything yet. Just wait here. And so the idea that they're suggesting that Rehoboam convey to the people is that he's stronger than his father Solomon. And it feels like that the perception of the young advisors and Rehoboam was that if they reduced the load on the people, that they'd be perceived as weak. Perhaps Rehoboam felt, being the newly crowned king, that he needed to make a statement here with a show of power and authority. In verse 11, he uses another figure of speech. And he says more plainly, my father loaded you with a heavy burden, a heavy yoke. I will add to that burden. And then he uses another figure of speech. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. And the reference to scorpions there, most scholars see that as a specific type of whip, a brutal type of whip that had barbs on the end of it. Warren Wiersbe, in his commentary on these verses, says the young counselors were interested mostly in being important and magnifying themselves and the authority of the new king. They thought the best way to do that was to make a show of force. Youth in general seek to have authority and freedom until they make the painful discovery that they may not be ready to use these precious gifts wisely. But before we get too harsh on our assessment of these young advisors, we need to keep in mind that there are old fools as well as young fools. And age is no guarantee of wisdom or even useful experience. After admonishing both the older saints and the younger ones, Peter wrote, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So, the people there, when Rehoboam responded in this way, they understood, they could see clearly that Rehoboam wanted to exalt himself at their expense. Probably they also understood the role that the young men had played, the young advisors had played. And so this harsh approach was going to cost them dearly. In verse 12, it tells us that Jeroboam and the people came to Rehoboam on the third day, just as the king had directed. And the king answered the people harshly, for he ignored the advice of the elders that the elders had given him. Rehoboam was 41 years old when he became king. So this man who's 41 years old, who'd grown up in the palace, he had had 3 days to consider this matter. He had had access to the best advisors, those who could give him sound advice. His father had written a book of practical proverbs about wisdom, one of which says, "A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." Proverbs 15:1. But Rehoboam's leadership was motivated by pride, not humility. And pride knows nothing of gentleness and kindness. Proverbs 12:18 says, "There is one who speaks like the piercings of a sword, but the tongue of the wise promotes health." So he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men. And he said basically just what the young men had advised him to say. "My father made your yoke heavy. I'll add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips. I'll discipline you with scorpions," or these barbed whips. So the way he spoke was rough. The words he used were harsh. Instead of lightening the load, he announced that he would make it heavier. And he used those figures of speech there, both in his words and his manner. He made it clear to the people that he was important and powerful, and they were unimportant and weak. The results of that are predictable. Verse 15 tells us, "So the king did not listen to the people because it was a turn of events from the Lord." Some of your translations say it was the providence of the Lord, in order to establish his word, which the Lord spoke through Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. You remember in last week's lesson, we talked about the encounter between the prophet Ahijah and Jeroboam. And Ahijah had this new cloak, and he took it off and he tore it into 10 to 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces, because God's going to tear the kingdom away from Solomon, and you will be king over 10 tribes." So verse 15 tells us that that God used Rehoboam's misguided actions here as an instrument for fulfilling that prophecy from Ahijah. We need to be careful to understand this does not excuse Rehoboam's foolishness. It reminds us that the promises of God will be fulfilled, and that God uses all kinds of people and all kinds of events to accomplish his purposes. So Rehoboam doesn't get a pass here because of his bad behavior and his foolish behavior, but we see how God used that to fulfill his purposes and his promise to Jeroboam. Verses 16 through 19. "When all Israel saw that the king had not listened to them, the people replied to the king, saying, 'What share do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, Israel. Now look after your own house, David. So Israel went away to their tents. But as for the sons of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah, Rehoboam reigned over them. And then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was in charge of the forced labor, and all Israel stoned him to death. King Rehoboam hurried to mount his chariot to flee to Jerusalem. So Israel has broken with the house of David to this day. So Rehoboam's refusal to listen to sound advice, his arrogance, led to tragic events. When Israel saw that the king hadn't listened to them, that he was more interested in himself than in being a servant to them, they rebelled. And the words here in verse 16 are the words of Sheba, a troublemaker back in David's time, who had led a rebellion against David when he was a Benjaminite, and he felt like that the people of Judah were given favorable treatment because David's of the tribe of Judah. And so he led this rebellion. You see that in 2 Samuel chapter 20, verse 1. Now a worthless man happened to be there whose name was Sheba, the son of Bichri, a Benjaminite, and he blew the trumpet and said, We have no share in David, nor do we have an inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tents, Israel. So that they echoed that refrain from Sheba. And so they left this assembly and they made Jeroboam their king. Verse 17, as for the sons of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah, Rehoboam reigned over them. So by this time, the 12 tribes of Israel, they had divided the territory, and each tribe got an allotment. But over the course of time, some people moved from one tribe's area into the area of another tribe. So there were people from those 10 northern tribes who had migrated and lived in the area of Judah. And that's what verse 17 is talking about. The sons of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah. And they remained here under Rehoboam's reign. Verse 18, King Rehoboam sent this guy who was in charge of the forced labor to try to compel the northern tribes to accept him as king, and they stoned him to death here. This caused Rehoboam to get in his chariot and make his way south. And Shechem's on the northern edge of the tribe of Ephraim, so he had quite a ways to go here through enemy territory, if you will. So he made his way back to Jerusalem to relative safety. Verse 19 tells us that Israel has broken with the house of David to this day. So effectively, this divided Israel into two nations. From henceforth, Israel will be the designation for the northern kingdom. Judah, the designation for the southern kingdom. Verse 20 tells us it came about when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, that they sent word and called him to the assembly, and they made him king over all Israel. None except the tribe of Judah alone followed the house of David. This gets a little bit confusing here. When we read the account of Ahijah, the prophet, his encounter with Jeroboam, and he said 10 tribes would be given to Jeroboam. One tribe would remain for David's ancestors. Of course, that one tribe obviously is Judah here. None except the tribe of Judah alone followed the house of David. Traditionally, we have understood the northern kingdom consisted of 10 tribes, the southern kingdom 2 tribes. And traditionally, those 2 tribes were Judah and Benjamin. Judah and Benjamin are frequently listed together. If you look in 2 Chronicles 11:3, tell Rehoboam the son of Solomon, king of Judah, and all Israel in Judah and Benjamin. So Judah and Benjamin are together. Later on, King Asa of Judah had an army of 300,000 from Judah, carrying large shields and spears, 280,000 from Benjamin, carrying shields and wielding bows, all of them valiant warriors. So it indicates, it seems like, the southern kingdom's made up of Judah and Benjamin. There's another factor in all of that. If you read the original I'm not finding the word I'm looking for here, the original breaking down of and allotment of the land. All of the land that was given to Simeon was within Judah. It's surrounded by Judah. And the cities that are listed as being part of the allotment of Simeon are later counted with Judah's. And so there's an implication there that the tribe of Simeon was kind of absorbed into Judah. But however you understand all of that, when he talks about the one tribe, Judah is the predominant tribe of the southern kingdom, and Judah is the tribe of David. So, when Rehoboam got back to Jerusalem, as we read on in chapter 12, when Rehoboam had come to Jerusalem, he assembled the house of Judah, the tribe of Benjamin. He got a big army together to fight against the house of Israel, to restore the kingdom to Rehoboam, son of Solomon. But the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God, saying, tell Rehoboam, son of Solomon, king of Judah, and all the house of Judah and Benjamin and the rest of the people, saying, this is what the Lord says, you shall not go up nor fight against your relatives, the sons of Israel. Return every man to his house, for this thing has come from me. So they listened to the word of the Lord and returned to go their way in accordance with the word of the Lord. So when Shemaiah spoke the word of the Lord, told them to stand, not to go, and they were obedient. So Jeroboam became king of the 10 northern tribes. He reigned for a number of years there. He was very concerned that the people would turn back to Rehoboam if they went to Jerusalem, to the temple, to worship. And so he constructed alternate worship centers north of, a few miles north of Jerusalem in Bethel, and then way further north in Dan, up near the northern extremities of Israel. And so he established these alternate worship centers, and he mixed the worship of the Lord with the worship of Baal. He erected golden calves in Dan and Bethel. And so the proclamations he made are similar to those of Aaron when he built the golden calf there. He continued this practice of worshiping in the high places in his kingdom. He installed his own priesthood. He created his own worship festivals. And so the idolatry of Jeroboam became a standard that the writer of Kings will use to compare to all the other northern kings. And we'll see the phrase, he walked in all the ways of Jeroboam. So if David's a model of a righteous king, Jeroboam's the model for the wicked king. As it goes on in chapter 13 and chapter 14, it talks more about Jeroboam's reign. And in 1 Kings 14:19, it tells us the rest of the acts of Jeroboam, how he made war and how he reigned. Behold, they're written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel. And the time that Jeroboam reigned was 22 years, and he lay down with his fathers, and his son Nadab reigned in his stead. 14th chapter also gives us some details about Rehoboam's reign. Now we've got two countries, we've got two different kings, we've got two different reigns here. Rehoboam reigned for 17 years. And his reign is kind of a mixture of good and evil. There was continued idolatry in the land. He either sanctioned it or he was too weak to prevent it. Shrines to foreign gods and Canaanite gods were built. And as a result, the Egyptian king came and attacked them. They repented, and so God didn't destroy them completely, but the Egyptian king took away temple treasures. The kingdom was reduced in size. They kind of became a vassal state of Egypt here. In summarizing the reign of Rehoboam, the Chronicles indicates how Rehoboam repented and there was some good in Judah. Worship of the Lord continued in the temple in Jerusalem. And as the worship under Jeroboam in the northern kingdom got further from the Lord, a lot of the Levites and priests from that area migrated to Jerusalem. So, Rehoboam had a number of wives. The wife he loved most was Maacah, daughter of Absalom. It was her son Abijah whom he appointed to be his successor. And so he reigned 17 years. It's a very interesting time in Israel there. But the focus of the lesson here today, failure to listen to wise counsel contributes to conflict. So we see Rehoboam. He got good counsel, but he wouldn't listen to it. He was arrogant, and he was more interested in himself than in being a servant of the people. We can all learn from that. There's a tendency sometimes for us to be harsh and arrogant in our convictions. And so this lesson is a clear warning against that arrogant, harsh spirit. Come back next week and we'll pick up and continue in our study of the two kingdoms here. Thank you.